Across more than 5 decades in every role she's held, the Honourable Louise Arbour has carried the same conviction, that a free society depends on institutions properly being held to account, that the law stands between power and the powerless, that the dignity of every person should not be a product of the accidents of geography, citizenship, or convenience, and that Canada's place in the world is to be a country that lives those propositions and helps others to live them as well.
Prime Minister Mark Carney announcing his pick for Canada's next Governor-General. Louise Arbour has had a long and distinguished legal career. A francophone from Montreal, she served as a Supreme Court Justice. Later, Arbour worked as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she helped prosecute war crimes in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Arbour was asked about her role in preserving national unity at a time when Alberta and Quebec could face possible referendums on separation.
I think there is a space for the Governor-General to be conducive of Canadian dialogue with respect to diverse. I've mentioned the diversity of our people, diversity of views, of opinions, of experiences, but all that, I think, in a spirit of respect and moving the country forward in an ambitious, united way.
Okay, we're going to start there with the power panel. We've got Supriya Dwivedi, who was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Amanda Galbraith was an advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Nathan Cullen is a former NDP MP and British Columbia New Democrat cabinet minister. And Emily Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir. It is good to see you all. Supriya, what do you make of this? Certainly, you can't argue the resume is a little bit thin in the pick for Louise Arbour, but what do you make of this choice by Mark Carney?
Yeah, I mean, look, she's clearly more than qualified for the role, right? As you mentioned, incredibly impressive resume as a legal scholar and a jurist, fluently bilingual. And, she's been in roles where she would have faced some level of scrutiny in the past. So I'd imagine whatever ends up getting thrown at her by the Conservatives in particular, chances are she'll be able to, roll with it, so to say. That said, given her past involvement in things like the Global Compact on Migration, which the Conservatives under Andrew Scheer at the time were saying that Canada, if we were going to sign on to it, would mean we would no longer have any control over our borders or our immigration targets, which was obviously false at the time and then is now obviously even more false since the things that they said would happen did not happen. I'd expect some level of organized grumbling from those on the right. Either about, the issue I just mentioned or about her work into sexual harassment and sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces, or, even past commentary that she would have made with respect to the IDF's use of disproportional force in Gaza. So, right. I certainly think it's a good pick, but it remains to be seen what level of grumbling will happen as a result.
Well, we haven't seen anything from the Conservatives on this yet, not even to the formal pro forma acknowledgement of the pick and that sort of a thing. So clearly there's some issues there that they're calibrating in terms of their response. But Amanda, just what are your thoughts? I don't know if you want to go through that litany of concerns that Supriya outlined, or if you want to just focus on Ms. Arbour herself. What do you make of this pick?
I think she's an eminently qualified Canadian to do this job. Candidly, someone of her caliber, we're probably lucky that she's willing to take on this role, which I think is both ceremonial, but in times of great crisis, for example, as we saw in 2008 under Michaëlle Jean, actually do end up making big decisions around the future of government. So I do think, she's qualified for it. Certainly I think conservative partisans and folks will differ from her public positions in the past. And I think that's fair. Right? She's taken political jobs and she's had political advocacy there or on issues. And that's as someone who's intelligent, who moves in big circles in the world, that's natural for anybody. I don't think there's a lot of political benefit to the Conservatives taking aim at the Governor General. So my suspicion is we'll get some sort of pro forma response to this and they'll move on to issues that are actually or preoccupying Canadians as opposed to this job.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Nathan, what will happen here, because David Johnston was the Conservative pick to be Governor General, and he got burned to the ground during the foreign interference thing when he took on the special rapporteur role. A lot of international experience from Ms. Arbour, a lot of institutional experience from Ms. Arbour, similar to the Prime Minister himself. Just what do you make of sort of the resume symmetry there, and why maybe Mark Carney made this pick?
Yeah, unless the Conservatives are looking to upset the monarchist League of Canada, which I've done, and I don't recommend it to anybody, really. I didn't know who they were until I said something about the royals and the monarchy. But if our standards now are 42 honorary degrees and Supreme Court justices, I just don't know what this country's coming to, David. I mean, this is obviously, I would argue, an overqualified person for the job, because there is some tone setting and symbolism of the voice coming from the GG, but they have to stay so neutral, so perfectly neutral on things that are happening in the country, other than unity and peace and goodwill, which are fine, that there's just such a small part of the job that would draw on her enormous talents and intelligence. I wish we had someone like this there when Mr. Harper, I think, incorrectly prorogued Parliament to not lose government. I would have loved to have seen what a GG like this would have said, as opposed to just letting him do it. But aside from that, I worry she's going to get bored. I mean, it's a lot of ribbon cutting. It's a lot of opening schools, which is all very nice. And maybe the Prime Minister's got some other ambitions for the role. That's my only thought in asking someone like this to do it, because she's so qualified and experienced.
There is a whole sliding doors moment there where we have a Prime Minister Dion for a period of time. That would have been an interesting thing to see. But Emily, on that, Mark Carney did suggest today that he would seek her advice, Ms. Arbour's advice in this role. And, you know, the British tradition of, like, usually on Wednesdays, the Prime Minister meets with the King and they talk privately. I don't know if he's looking at doing something similar to that, or just, you know, maybe her counsel on things, because they will be neighbors when everyone's settled in. I mean, what do you make of this appointment? A Montrealer who speaks fluent French, so the bilingual issue for a lot of Quebecers is set aside here.
It is set aside. I will also mention that I had the honor of sitting with Louise Arbour on an advisory committee and getting to know her a little bit. And besides all the qualifications that have been mentioned, she also happens to be a wonderful woman and somebody I would like to have as a neighbor. And so if the Prime Minister, I think the Prime Minister would be remiss not to take advantage of having someone so smart sitting across the street. In terms of having someone that can be a special advisor on international affairs, certainly, and issues of rule of law, as you know, there's some rulings by the Supreme Court that are waiting to happen as well, especially the one on Bill 21 and everything that has to do with the notwithstanding clause. I think off-the-record advice from Louise Arbour on how to handle what's going to be coming in the fall would also be very precious. It also symbolically, I think, balances the ways in which Mark Carney has been behaving and speaking in a very pragmatic way. This links back to the conversation we had last week about how Mark Carney seems to be talking about economic deals and trade, and not so much about issues of values and upholding, you know, the international standards and law and the humanitarian principles that the world has sat on and built infrastructures around since the end of World War II. I think Louise Arbour symbolizes that this is still part of what the government of Canada wants to do. We'll see if it goes beyond the symbol. And the last thing that I would say is that one thing that was unfortunate as people were looking north, you know, to maybe an invasion of Greenland by the United States, but also just the issue of Arctic sovereignty being a core priority for this government. Mary Simon being a diplomat of Arctic sovereignty by trade, she was sort of sitting on the shelf. And I hope that maybe after her mandate is over, she can serve in a different way to the issue of Arctic sovereignty and Arctic diplomacy, because that's really her core competency and her core mission, and that would, you know, get her away from the bilingualism or trilingualism scandals and back to her core and the ways in which she's been serving the country her whole career as well. Yeah,
a lot of criticism for Mary Simon for not speaking French, though speaking English, obviously, and Inuktitut being bilingual, just not in the official way. Look, you know, I get the frustration, but having an Inuk woman in that role for a period of time is a big moment in Canadian history as well.
Absolutely.
I just wonder, I want to get a quick round on this moment in Canadian history. Like, we have a Prime Minister, Emily, I'll start with you on this, who grew up in Edmonton, born in the North, and Alberta is heading towards a possible referendum on sovereignty. And we now have a Governor General from Quebec. And if the PQ win and make good on their promises, the GG and the PM could be from the two parts of the country. I mean, what kind of a role do you see the Governor General and Ms. Arbour playing in a moment like this? Is it stay in your lane and leave it, or do you speak out in the interest of a united country from that position?
I think it goes back to what I was saying about Bill 21. There's things in which you can be the right person, but speaking from the wrong place. And if even Nathan is riled up sometimes about the monarchy, imagine what it would be for Quebecers to have somebody who stands for the crown trying to get involved in this conversation. And so I think it's more about off-the-records advice than it is about formal position making. I think it's somebody that is smart to have around in Ottawa to be able to have a cup of tea with, but it's not so much about what's going to be her role in public than about her role as an informal advisor.
Right. So, Priya, how do you see it, right? I just wonder, because Rosie, off the top of the show, had the smart, analysis that this is about stability, right? This pick in a big way, because you have, given what we've seen sometimes in that office. How do you see a role given maybe the separatist fervor we could face over the next couple of years here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'd certainly agree with a lot of what Emily had to say with respect to the fact that I don't know if Quebecers would want to sit there and listen to a representative of the King tell them what's what when it goes down to, a question about secession or independence or sovereignty or what have you. And I think to Nathan's earlier point, I think the first point he made is that having somebody who's so qualified can be tempting, of course, to have her step into the public light to be able to, weigh in on some of these issues, particularly given her background. But I think it's perhaps safest not to, even if we are perhaps leaving her on the shelf. But, as long as her and the Prime Minister are able to discuss and have those conversations, I think that's what's most important.
Yeah, Amanda, I've never been cursed with being accused of overqualification like Ms. Arbour is, but so I'm just unleashed. I mean, just what do you make of this? And then Nathan, I want to move on to other things.
I think there's been, no small conversation around focusing on the frustration and with the Prime Minister around the team he's got around him, right? He hasn't been able to pick his own folks. There's a couple of ministers we know he trusts, but it's certainly not broadly felt across the government. And what he's done here is recruited someone who is eminently qualified, the point, can play a quiet advisory role if needed. We are going to be facing a national unity crisis over the next year, which will, I think, occupy a significant amount of his time. So even if she's not out in Quebec, maybe she's out in English Canada, right? Having some conversations around that, right? There's a role, I think, for the Governor General to play, not to mention the fact we just saw, I think, one of the better diplomatic efforts by the King going to the U.S. while not explicitly defending Canada. I think there was a subscript to that. Our Prime Minister has indicated a strong rapprochement with the UK. So I would expect him to use this as some muscle in some ways, either diplomatically, quietly behind the scenes. He needs more people around him that he can trust to move forward, particularly on this national unity question. So I'll be interesting to see what he does with her, because she is candidly, I think people broadly saying she's overqualified for this job. So what has she actually been hired to do?
Yeah, Nathan, it's weird to say that someone's overqualified to be the King's representative, but here we are. I mean, certainly her professional training and judgment she would have the sense not to inflame a national unity crisis, you would hope, right? And that she would know not to step into it.
She's had public-facing roles, but this role is so particular and so kind of weird. You're the representative. You sign every bill into law and every order in council into actual performance, but you don't really have a lot of power. And so it's the representation of power without the actual effect, which is always what confused and driven me nuts. But the expectations will be what they be. But I mean, Charles worked well in the States because Trump wants to be a king. That's why, he's smiling and glad to have him in the room and doesn't even appreciate the insults or the digs that are coming his way, because a king to a wannabe king works. A king's representative in Canada, during people talking about secessionist movements in Quebec, absolutely right, as Emily said, great person, wrong role. She'll have to be careful, and she might make mistakes. I could totally foresee that. Judges are known to have a lot of confidence in speaking because they have so much authority from the bench. This isn't that. This is something very different.
Right. Look, Gigi is like hosting a show. You look like you're in charge. We're just executing a team's plan. From this hiring, we want to go to a demand for a firing because Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is renewing his call for the Prime Minister to fire his immigration minister. That is after a former member of Iran's Revolutionary Guard was granted a permit to visit Canada last week. Now, the former commander was able to land, but was then turned away at one of Toronto's airports.
Prime Minister appointed this Liberal minister. He's kept her in place for a year. He meets with her weekly. Is it because she's incompetent, or is her incompetence actually his incompetence, and when will he fire her?
Senior officials of the IRGC are not admissible in Canada, full stop. What has this government done? We've taken back control of immigration. We have reduced asylum seekers by 1/3, temporary foreign workers by half, foreign students by 2/3. This government is taking control of immigration.
Okay, Nathan, they're talking about Lena Diab there, who was asked a lot of questions at committee, and the passive voice and a lot of process came out. What do you make of this push over this IRGC commander being able to get to Toronto and then being turned away, the call for her to be fired?
Yeah, this is one more thing. The Conservatives smell a bit of blood in the water, to use a terrible term. I was at an event with a lot of ministers last week in Ottawa, and everybody knows the performance review is going on right now. It sounds like no shuffle till maybe June, but one's coming. Everyone's got to be reviewing how they're doing. I'd be very surprised if this is not one of the hot seats in cabinet in terms of moving out. Just hasn't communicated well, took over a difficult file, et cetera, but Carney's supposed to be someone who's all about performance and not about, soft personality type choices. So the Conservatives want to get a win on an issue that's been very, very problematic for this government, well, the past government and this government trying to mop it up.
So, Priya, how do you see this particular one playing out? I mean, they've been critical writ large of the immigration policies over the last number of years, and there's been a big course correction and change under Prime Minister Carney. But on the performance of the minister, them singling her out today in question period.
I don't know. I always think it's kind of silly when politicians demand a minister be fired because, more often than not, nothing really happens. And then the person demanding the firing just looks like they were talking to nobody, right? This also isn't the first time that the Conservatives have demanded her firing, though it's possible that the other time that they demanded it, it was alongside demanding that Ministers Fraser and Miller also join in on the Minister Diab communal sacking. But I agree with Nathan. Like, I've heard the same about a shuffling being sort of talked about in certain hallways, and I don't think it's likely that we're going to get one before June. But I don't think a general shuffle of sorts would be the worst thing for this government, and I don't think someone who has a little bit more experience, let's say, in coming under fire and being able to deal with it gracefully would be a bad move for this file in particular. But I would just say that if the immigration file and if Minister Diab's performance was indeed like an actual perceptible problem for this government, then we're at least not seeing that reflected in any of the opinion polling that we've seen so far. So while I agree that a shuffle is probably coming and that a shuffle for this role in particular is probably the better move, I'm not sure if there's a real actual pressing impetus to act on firing Minister Diab from her role in the way that the Conservatives are suggesting.
No, that's a good point, Amanda, but maintaining your lead, self-scouting is important in sports, right? To assess for your own vulnerabilities and adjust for it. I wonder if this is an incident that leads to that kind of approach as they reconsider their inner circle.
Yeah, I think there's been a series of incidents with this minister, including grumblings from within the Liberal caucus around her performance, her accessibility. I think anybody on this panel would know. I'd be shocked if she's still in that job after June or the next shuffle, whenever that may be. The other thing she's facing, candidly, she's got a very strong opposition critic in Michelle Rempel, who's like a very detailed, sophisticated MP who leverages media, who cares and knows this issue, and I think has taken her to task at committee. So this would be an issue for any government, in particular for this Liberal government who is wearing some of the sins of the previous administration. They need a strong communicator in there. This minister is not that. And yes, I think Supriya is very well to point out that they are riding high in the polls. But to your point, David, you do need to shore up your weak flanks. I would say this is a weak flank and an issue for them to manage going forward. And they'd be well placed to have someone in there that could actually parry, I think, a bit more effectively with Rumpel and others.
Yeah, and Emily, like they've had some new people come in to the by-election wins. There will be other by-elections later this year. Who knows how quickly those will happen? Just what do you make of this particular episode and these repeated calls from the Conservatives for Ms. Diab to go?
They have found a weak link, as everybody's mentioned, and so that's why part of why they're hammering on this nail. And politically, it's understandable that they're doing so. And yet two things can be true at the same time. There's the fact that they found an actual, real, timely weak link, and the fact that they have been linking it to Sean Fraser and Mark Miller in a way that actually colleagues over at Radio-Canada have just been counting the number of times that Pierre Poilievre has been mentioning still Justin Trudeau in question period, and it's as if the guy was still sitting. And so there's the fact that there's a weak link now in immigration, and there's also the fact that they're circling back to issues of Justin Trudeau's era, as to make Canadians feel as if they're fighting the past government and that record more than the actual situation, and that's not necessarily helping if you're essentially fighting ghosts all the time as well. And so I think the two things are happening at the same time, that it's not necessarily very smart for Pierre Poilievre to focus on issues of the past and not moving on to what's happening right now. And at the same time, they absolutely have found somebody who is not the sharpest minister in cabinet right now.
Yeah, Trudeau is gone, and he is not coming back. I mean, punching fog, you're never going to land a solid blow. But look, another battle that's emerging is the push to deal with social media platforms. The Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, he's asking parents across his province for their input. Moe wants to know what they think about a potential ban on social media for children under the age of 16.
Social media, we understand, can have a very positive role to play in so many individuals, and in particular in youth's life. It can help young people connect, to learn, to express themselves. But we also know that there are negative aspects, and there are serious risks to that connection to social media platforms as well. We have seen all too often cases of cyberbullying, body image pressures, mental health issues like loneliness and depression that have been exacerbated, exposures to dangerous content online, and so much more.
Supriya, I know you've looked at a lot of this stuff. This is tough to regulate. It's tough to ban, but it's pretty clear, for a premier, I mean, right? And Scott Moe is going to join us right after this panel. But he's not wrong when he outlines all of the challenges and all of the problems that particularly young people face in this stuff.
Sure, he's not wrong. But let's go bit by bit. So, okay. I mean, first and foremost, this shouldn't be something that any province should be undertaking themselves, right? I don't think a piecemeal approach to this province to province instead of a unified national policy is going to work. I think it's kind of dumb and it won't be all that effective. The second thing I think we need to keep in mind is that any jurisdiction that is selling some sort of social media ban for kids without pairing it with a more comprehensive regulatory framework that will actually get to the root of the issues that Premier Moe is talking about, with these platforms, we're doing the most half-assed thing imaginable, because not only are the harms incurred online not exclusive to children on these platforms, but then the minute these kids age out of the ban, we're just kind of throwing them to the wolves of the unregulated platform-based internet. And then the third thing that we need to remember, and this is where it really annoys me, this conversation, because the larger conversation makes it sound like this is all about kids, is that any age assurance scheme, and this is where language matters because age estimation and age verification are not the same thing, will mean that adults will be subject to the mechanism as well, not just kids. And age verification necessarily means verifying one's age. And there's only two ways to do that. You either upload a government-issued ID, like a passport, or you have the government come up with some sort of mandatory digital identification that we'd all have to submit to when logging onto social media apps. And if there's a parental consent component to be able to use certain apps, then we're also adding another layer of uploading proof of being the parent or guardian in charge of the child. So just with that, in my case, that would mean uploading my passport, uploading my daughter's birth certificate, and then presumably uploading my husband's death certificate to show that I'm, in fact, the primary parent in charge. If we're going the age estimation route, That means it can mean better cybersecurity for adults because you're not uploading anything, but it's also incredibly error prone.
Right.
And it tends to use other surveillance mechanisms to better estimate the age of the user. So it has its own privacy issues.
Okay.
What we need is for the federal government to reintroduce the core aspect of the Trudeau online harms legislation, which was a duty to act responsibly, and then applying that to AI chatbots and large online platforms. If you have a duty to act responsibly, that effectively ensures that these AI chatbots and social media companies would have to consider the risk of their products and then demonstrate that there have been active steps to mitigate those risks. All other consumer-facing products are subject to that duty, by the way, and it makes absolutely no sense why AI and social media companies continue to be exempt. But we need the federal government to actually do something about it, and we need premiers to stop coming up with this half-baked policy solutions to complex issues.
Well, look, in defense of Scott Moe, I think he's trying to start the conversation to maybe urge the national government to act. That's part of it there, right? But Nathan, I saw you reacting to a lot of that. A lot of what Supriya is talking about. We had very smart young people from the McGill Institute on last week saying much the same thing. What's your thoughts here?
Well, there's zero knowledge protocols. There's all sorts of technology available. The folks who are in the business actually have to become partners to this. I agree with the end of what Supriya said. I very much disagree with putting up all the barriers and saying, what are the provinces doing? The provinces are responding to what they're hearing from their constituents. They're responding to the absolute vacuum that's going on at the federal government under this Prime Minister's leadership, that he's chosen not to touch this at all. And on the other side of the technical challenges, how do we do this properly? Bring in the folks that actually understand how this could be done, pay attention to privacy and all of those important things that Supriya said. On the other side, we have the undeniable, proven, disastrous, and sometimes lethal harms that are happening to our kids. So we've seen this in the past. BC has actually been a leader in being able to take companies to court successfully and proving harms. They did it, as you know, David, you've had them on. You've had the outstanding Attorney General, Nikki Sharma, on and shown how the provinces jump on the legal side so that we can show real recourse if these companies don't join in and actually prove a way to protect our kids from being sent the predators, the body shaming and harming, the suicidal thoughts, all this stuff that's gotten into our kids and into their minds and hearts in such a deep way. So the outcome is so important. I guess the ability to overcome all those things that Supriya listed, which are not wrong, is just so demanding of us. And if the provinces need to push and the feds need to come to the table reluctantly or whatever it is, then so be it. And I encourage people to listen to Wab Kinu's speech on this. It just nails it spot on.
You know, Emily, okay, well, look, we're tight on time. I got to get Emily and Amanda in. Emily, your thought, and look, part of the problem is, you know, your drinking water and your sewer are coming out of the same pipe on your phone because of just the way social media has gone. It's this polluted, toxic mess. What are your thoughts on what's being promoted here?
First of all, some of the organizations that are asking for a ban on minors are actually sponsored sometimes by Meta and others, and that tells you everything about what Supriya just said, that sometimes the getting more personal information from us is something that they'd be really, really happy to have, and we need to be having perhaps a different conversation that also acknowledges the gravity of the problem that Nathan just outlined. It's the fact that those apps are toxic to our kids because our kids are the most vulnerable, but they also are toxic to ourselves. And as the adults in the room, sometimes we're less likely to acknowledge it. And so it's the fact that those apps are toxic that is the issue. And it's not something that stops being the case at the age of 16. It's been a tool of radicalization and polarization and poisoning of democracies in other ways as well. And so we need to make sure that the environment isn't toxic to human society and not just to children.
No, I hear you. Look, I turned 53 yesterday, and I've abandoned all of my social media platforms. It's like I've gotten death threats for hosting a cable show in 2026. I mean, it's insane. Amanda, last word to you on this one.
Well, first of all, happy belated birthday,
Thank you
David.
very much.
I mean, I approach this two ways. One is as a mom of young kids, probably like Supriya, mine are toddlers. but they already understand phones, and I am fighting in every way possible to keep screens away from them as long as possible. I think we've over-indexed on accessibility there. So to me, is like any way we can keep this stuff away from our kids, the better. Two, I think the politics of this is very interesting, right? Because my understanding is the feds have sort of voiced that they're considering this ban. The provinces are coming out, maybe they're not moving fast enough, or, you know, they see some political opportunity here to forward or be the forefront of the conversation. So they're signaling they want to have a chat about it without actually laying out any firm policies. So I think this is going to be a big political conversation over the next couple years, in particular the next year, both for the feds and the provinces. And it's, I think, absolutely critical how it shakes out for our young people, because, you know, it's hard enough to deal with it as an adult, the threats that you get, let alone when you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old.
Yeah, look, we've imposed a ban on it in our house, which is the quickest way to send them there. Because, you know, they banned beer in my house, and that didn't work. Look, Supriya, I know you got a lot to say on this. We will revisit this. I'm out of time today, but this is a big topic, and it's something government's got to get a handle on. The trade situation, it complicates it, because the algorithms are all in the front row at the inauguration. Supriya Dwivedi, Amanda Galbraith, Nathan Cullen, Emily Nicola, always appreciate the insight. Thank you all so much for being here.